Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you all fall asleep. So before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. The night had fallen like any other. My son Miguel and I decided to go for a walk in the park, which at that hour was a little clear and only a few blocks from home. It was a place we knew well, with meandering paths and a small lake in the center. Miguel had always loved to run and explore every nook and cranny. His laughter, full of life, echoed in my mind as I contemplated his inexhaustible energy. As we walked, the sky slowly darkened, but I paid no attention to it. The clouds were gathering, and a cool breeze began to blow. Miguel, excited, ran toward the playground. I watched him climbing up the play structures, sliding down the slides and laughing out loud. That moment of happiness vanished when the first clap of thunder rumbled in the distance, an ominous sound that made my stomach clench. The rain began to fall, and soon became a torrent that soaked the ground and surrounded us with a deafening sound. I looked around, seeking shelter, but the park was almost deserted. Most of the visitors had left, leaving me practically alone with my son. "Miguel!" I shouted, trying to be heard above the roar of the rain. "Come back here!" But I received no answer. As the rain intensified, I decided it was time to leave. I walked quickly toward him, but I didn't see him. I could only notice a shadow that passed quickly across my vision. It was a man, standing under a tree, watching. My heart raced. I couldn't make out his features, but his posture was unsettling. Something about his presence made me feel that he was not just a passerby. I ignored the cold that ran down my back and called out to Miguel once again. The sound of my footsteps were drowned out by the sound of the rain. When I reached the playground, Miguel was simply not there. My heart sank and panic began to take hold of me. I looked around, searching for his small figure among the games, but there was no sign of him. I shouted, desperate. The rain was coming down hard, soaking my clothes and turning the ground into a quagmire. I started to run, calling his name, but the echo was lost in the noise of the storm. I looked towards where the man was, but there was no trace of him. My steps became faster, anxiety taking hold of me. I ran to the lake, thinking perhaps he had come over to look at the ducks. But when I arrived, the place was empty, and the water was churning from the incessant rain. I stopped for a moment, trying to calm my breathing. Despair was beginning to take shape in my chest. I searched the playground again, checking behind the swings and climbing frames. It was as if Miguel had vanished. The thought that something might have happened to him paralyzed me. The image of the man kept lurking in my mind, and the feeling that I was not alone in the park intensified. I decided I had to get out of there. I started walking towards the exit of the park, my eyes scanning every corner. "Miguel," I kept calling, but my voice sounded farther and farther away, as if the storm was swallowing everything. When I reached the entrance, I saw a group of people sheltering under a kiosk. I rushed over, my heart pounding. I asked them if they had seen a small child, but they all shook their heads. By that time, I was overwhelmed with anguish. I returned to the park, my mind filled with dark thoughts. The thought that someone might have taken Miguel filled me with dread. Every step I took was a torment. I feared time was slipping away. The rain was still falling, but now it seemed like a backdrop for my worst fears. As I searched, I noticed that the park, which had once been a familiar place, now felt strange, almost hostile. The shadows of the trees seemed to lengthen, and the sound of water hitting the ground echoed like a heartbeat. Despair was becoming a constant pressure in my chest. I decided to divide the park into sections, systematically searching every corner. The duck area, the flower path, the bench in front of the lake. Every time I turned the corner of a path, I expected to see my son with his carefree smile. But each time, what I found was silence and rain. My mind began to wander. I thought about the man I had seen earlier. Was it him? Could he have been behind my son's disappearance? My heart raced at the possibility. I needed to find him, not just Miguel, but answers. Finally, I came to a small clearing in the park where there was an old oak tree. The rain had begun to subside, but the atmosphere was still charged with tension. I looked up at the tree and saw something on the ground. I approached it and my heart stopped. It was a small shoe. Miguel's shoe. A shiver ran through my body. The rain stopped mattering to me. All I could think about was what it meant. I looked around, searching for some clue, something to tell me where he had gone. My mind went back to the man. I knew I had to find him. I ran back to the path where I had last seen him. I looked in every direction, anguish growing inside me. The rain had eased a bit, but the air was still thick with tension. The darkness was beginning to loom over me, making each shadow seem more menacing. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a branch rustling. I turned quickly, but there were only trees. The feeling that someone was watching me did not fade. I began to walk faster, my feet sloshing in the mud. The idea that Miguel was in danger pushed me to keep going, to not give up. The park felt increasingly desolate. The rain had made the air thick, and each step seemed heavier. I began to shout his name again, hoping he might hear me, but the reality was that I was alone, trapped in my own nightmare. I came to a trail that led into the woods that bordered the park. It wasn't a place I planned to go, but the thought that my little one might be there drove me on. The darkness thickened as I moved deeper into the trees, the sound of rain muffling around me. Every step I took was a struggle between hope and fear. The possibility that Miguel was in danger filled me with determination, but the forest was dark and silent, which increased my anxiety. As I advanced, the feeling that something was wrong intensified. After a while, I reached a clearing. The rain did not stop. I looked around, searching for any sign, but there was nothing. Only silence and shadows. I decided to get out of there. I started back down the path, but fear made me lose track of direction. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound was amplified in my mind. I was completely lost, and desperation made me run in circles. I found a path that seemed to lead back to the park. Desperation led me to speed up my pace. With each step, my heart beat faster, and the rain continued, like a curtain hiding the world. Arriving back at the park, the mood had changed. The light of the nearest street lamp was flickering, and the sound of the rain had changed to a whisper. I looked around, and the loneliness of the place weighed on me like a slab. I began to search the places I had already checked, but there was no trace. Despair turned into a feeling of emptiness. The thought that he might have disappeared completely filled me with an indescribable terror. I felt the chill of the night hovering over me, and the park felt darker than before. By this time, my mind was in chaos. What had happened? Where was Miguel? Fear and guilt washed over me. It had been my responsibility to take care of him, and now he was lost in this place. The rain began to fall harder again, and the sound became deafening. I ran aimlessly, my footsteps echoing in the night. Every noise was amplified in my mind, but it didn't matter anymore. I thought only of my son, of finding him before it was too late. I decided to go to the nearest police station. The idea that the police could help me gave me a small ray of hope. I ran towards the center of town, feeling the rain following me. Anguish filled me, but the determination to find my son was stronger. Arriving at the police station, the neon lights illuminated the dark night. I rushed in, desperately looking for help. The policeman looked at me, and I quickly explained the situation. They moved, taking my details, but the wait felt interminable. They offered me help and sent a group to search the park. As I waited, anxiety consumed me. Every second felt like an eternity. The rain kept falling, and the memory of Miguel haunted me. Hours passed, but there was no news. Frustration and fear gripped me. Where was my son? The thought that someone could have hurt him was unbearable. The night became a maze of anguish, and the rain seemed endless. After some time, an officer returned. His face was grave. He told me that they had searched everywhere in and around the park, but had found nothing. Despair flooded me. The rain was still falling, but it no longer mattered. The idea that Miguel was lost, perhaps in the hands of someone who had no mercy, filled me with an indescribable terror. I walked out of the police station, the rain pattering on my face. I looked up at the sky, feeling the weight of the world fall on my shoulders. I walked slowly, lost in thought, not knowing what to do next. The search had begun, but the storm that had started that night still raged in my heart. In the distance, the sound of laughter echoed. It was familiar, a memory of my son that seemed to mock my pain. I stared into the darkness, wondering if I would ever hear that laughter again. At that moment, I knew the search was not over. My determination flared up. I will not rest until I find my son. The struggle was just beginning, and the story of that rainy night would become a tale of despair and hope. 10 years have passed since that fateful night in the park, but the rain has never stopped falling in my memory. Every drop that hits the ground reminds me of Miguel, of his laughter, of his overflowing energy. Although time seems to have erased many things, my hope remains alive, like a small flame that refuses to go out. I have searched every nook and cranny, investigated every clue, and talked to countless people, but the truth is that time has made the search more difficult. However, every anniversary of her disappearance, I find myself back in that park, sometimes in the rain, sometimes in the bright sunshine, but always with the same purpose: to keep searching. Life has taken its course, and I have learned to live with the pain and uncertainty. But in my heart, I know that Miguel is still part of me. In every ray of sunshine that breaks through the clouds, in every whisper of the wind, I feel his presence, as if he is telling me not to give up. Despite the years, I still keep his room intact, like a shrine of memories. Every time I see his bicycle leaning against the wall or his jacket hanging on the coat rack, a wave of hope washes over me. Maybe one day my son will return. Maybe one day the rain will bring an answer. My hope has not faded. The search continues, and each passing day is a new reminder that a father's love is never extinguished. I am convinced that somehow I will meet him again. That cold and rainy night 15 years ago marked a before and after in my life. I will never forget the details. Each scene has become an open wound in my memory, always fresh, always aching. I was young at the time, and had just joined the police station a few months ago, and although I had already seen complicated situations, nothing had prepared me for what I was about to encounter. I received the call around midnight, during a quiet shift when the rain had begun to fall relentlessly. The voice on the radio was tense and urgent. An emergency at a house near my location. I remember the road, the lights of the street lamps casting shadows on the wet road, the pattering of the rain against the windshield, and the feeling that something dark was about to crumble. Arriving at the indicated address, I saw a modest house with a simple facade, barely distinguishable amidst the gloom. The interior lights were on, and through the windows I could make out shadows moving frantically. As I approached the door, I mentally prepared myself for what I might find, not knowing that it would haunt me for years to come. I entered the house, and the first thing I noticed was the smell of damp mixed with the pungent aroma of cheap disinfectant. It was an old house, with walls stained by time and a modest, worn decoration that spoke of years of neglect. The scene that awaited me was overwhelming. In the living room stood an old woman with a disheveled face, trembling from head to toe, without uttering a word. She seemed to have aged decades in minutes, and the terror in her expression was enough to put me on high alert. I knew the worst was in the next room. As I approached, I saw the trail of blood dripping from the door to the carpet. A thick silence filled the air, barely broken by the choked gasps of the old woman in the living room. As I opened the door, I was confronted with an image that would accompany me in recurring nightmares ever since. On the floor of the room, under the light of an old lamp, lay a young boy. He was barely 14 years old, his pale skin contrasting with the dark pool of blood that spread around him. The bullet wound in his chest was small, but it had been enough to stop his heart. Next to her, in shock, and with the gun still in her trembling hands, was her younger sister, a girl only 8 years old. The image was impossible to process. She was barely holding the gun, an old, heavy, rusty revolver that, for some inexplicable reason, had ended up in her hands. The girl was not crying or screaming. She just stood there, motionless, with a blank expression, lost in an abyss of incomprehension. I froze at the scene, not knowing whether to approach or keep my distance, and a chill that had nothing to do with the rain ran down my spine. The old woman in the living room began to sob, and I immediately understood what had happened. She was the wife of the children's uncle, who cared for them while their mother worked night shifts to support them. Apparently, the gun belonged to her husband, a man who, I later discovered, kept it locked in a dark corner of the closet, with the idea of protecting his family from any threat. But that night, fate had been merciless. I stood watching the scene, breathing heavily, unable to react immediately. The horror of the situation was too great to take in. I approached slowly and took the gun away from the girl's hands, careful not to frighten her further. She put up no resistance, barely seeming to register my presence. Her eyes were fixed on the void, and it was evident that she did not fully comprehend what had happened. She was a child, innocent in her ignorance, and the victim of a tragedy that should never have touched her. Questions began to accumulate in my mind. How had the gun gotten into his hands? Had he been playing with it? Had someone left it there carelessly? The mind was trying to make sense of something that, deep down, had no explanation. The gun should have been out of reach of any child. It should have been impossible for a tragedy of this magnitude to occur. But there it was, undeniable, like a scar etched in reality. The other officers arrived soon after and took over the scene, but the echo of the old woman's muffled screams, the girl's silence, and the empty stare of the body on the floor remained etched in my memory. That night was long. Preliminary investigation revealed that the uncle had been careless with the gun, leaving it on a low shelf unsecured, thinking the children would never find it. But childish curiosity, or perhaps simple chance, had caused the child to discover the revolver and, in an innocent act, pointed at her brother, unaware of the deadly consequences of a single shot. Days passed, and the memory of that scene took over my mind like a permanent shadow. I tried to go on with my life, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the girl standing there holding the gun, her face expressionless and her eyes lost. My job required me to be strong, to deal with the worst of humanity, but that image was beyond any limit. It was too much for me, a horror that haunted me even in my quiet moments. Time passed, but the weight of that night did not disappear. I tried to take refuge in routine, in duty, but there was always something to remind me. Maybe it was the rain, the sound of water hitting the roof of my car, the silence of an empty house at the end of a shift. There was always a detail that dragged me back to that moment, to that dark room, and the helplessness I had felt when I saw the tragedy that a single bullet had unleashed. Years later, even after seeing other difficult scenes, I felt that nothing compared to that night. The wound it had left on me was not healing, but was sinking deeper and deeper into my being. I understood over time that there was something in that experience that I could not overcome, a powerlessness rooted deep in my spirit. That night I understood that life is fragile, that a single mistake, a momentary carelessness, can shatter lives and take away the innocence of those who least deserve it. I stopped thinking of heroes and villains, of seeing the world in terms of good guys and bad guys. Instead, I saw people as complex shadows, full of weaknesses and fatal moments. Today, after so many years, I find myself trapped in the echo of that night. Every drop of rain brings me back to that house, that boy on the ground, and that girl with the gun in her hands. The scar is still open, the weight is still on my shoulders, and the horror of what I experienced on that night has not lost its intensity. I don't know if it ever will. Perhaps there are tragedies that remain there, immobile in time, like a portrait that haunts us incessantly. It all started so quickly, on a random night, when my friend and I were sharing with the nonchalance of someone who has never known true fear. We were walking back from a party, barely passing jokes and nonsense, when a vehicle pulled up next to us. I didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. I felt the tug on my arm, the pressure in my mouth, and suddenly we were in the dark. I couldn't see well in that closed vehicle, but I felt my friend next to me, breathing hard, both of us in silence, trapped in a spiral of panic that neither of us knew how to face. I knew he was scared too, although he was trying to remain calm. We could hear the cold voices of the kidnappers, their cutting instructions, and the silence that fell on us after each sentence, as heavy as a tombstone. They warned us to follow every order to the letter, not to do anything stupid. Every time they said it, I felt a stab of fear run through my body. I had to survive. I would do whatever it took. But my friend, he was different. He couldn't bear the thought of being subdued. As soon as we entered that abandoned cabin, a dank, dark place in the middle of nowhere, I knew. I could see in his eyes that he was not going to accept being there, that he was willing to risk anything rather than give in. Perhaps he thought it was a matter of courage, that he had to stand up to our captors, challenge their authority in some way. I, on the other hand, just wanted to live, but I knew that if he did something impulsive, we would both suffer the consequences. The rain pounded furiously on the roof of the hut, like a steady beat, like a clock ticking away the time running out. The atmosphere was charged with fear and tension. I watched every corner, trying to figure out at what point they would take us to the point of no return. But at that moment, what terrified me most was the impatience I could see in my friend's eyes. I knew something in him had broken. He didn't want to listen. He didn't want to wait. It was in the first carelessness that he tried to escape. We had barely been left unguarded and he signaled me. He jerked his head toward the door, whispering that this was our chance, that we couldn't wait around. But I knew that attempt would be a mistake. We were in no condition to stand up to our captors. I tried to warn him with my eyes, silently begging him not to stand still, but he was determined. With a swift, bold movement, he got up and ran for the door. The sound of his footsteps was almost inaudible under the roar of the storm, but time seemed to freeze when one of the kidnappers caught up with him. There was a moment's struggle, an instant when I thought that maybe, just maybe, he might make it. But the violence with which he was knocked down took my breath away. I saw his body collapse to the ground, the blows that fell on him, and the scream he tried to stifle as the rain continued to fall, ignorant of our tragedy. I could not move. I was paralyzed. Terror had devoured me from within. I felt the blood leave my face, my legs trembling as I watched the inevitable outcome take hold of him. The kidnappers were furious, and their faces distorted by rage and threat made it clear that there would be no mercy for us. I saw how they approached him, the violence in their eyes and the brutality in their movements. When the final blow fell on my friend, something in me broke too. I knew there was no way to reverse it, that any hope of surviving together was gone. Life slipped from his body under that merciless storm, and I knew that, from that moment on, I was alone. There was no more room for courage or pride. All that remained was the urgency to escape, to find a way out of that hell before they decided it was my turn too. The storm raged, as if the universe itself was witnessing this tragedy, impotent and deaf to our suffering. I felt a primitive instinct, a desperate need to survive. As their voices drifted away, as they dragged my friend's body without the slightest respect, I saw my chance. I barely had a window of time, but it was enough. I stood up, driven by terror, and ran for the exit. Every step I took was a risk, every move an opportunity to be discovered. But the survival instinct was stronger than fear. The rain enveloped me as soon as I stepped outside. I was wet to the bone and my legs were almost giving out from exhaustion. But I didn't stop. I ran without looking back, feeling the sticky mud on my feet, listening to the thunder that seemed to chase me. The image of my friend, the final moment of his life, haunted me, like an echo repeating over and over again. He had survived, but at a price I could never forget. Amid the darkness and the rain, I kept running. My lungs were burning. My legs were just a desperate trembling that propelled me forward, towards any place where I could be safe from that nightmare. Every step was agony. Every meter I advanced felt eternal. But then, like some kind of miracle in the gloom, I saw the lights of a vehicle approaching down the road. I waved my arms with the little strength I had left, hoping it would stop, hoping someone would understand the horror I had lived through. The car stopped, and without thinking twice, I rushed to the door. The driver's expression was one of disbelief and horror at the sight of me soaked, dirty, and wild-eyed. I didn't have to say much. A couple of halting words were enough for him to understand. Without asking any questions, he took me straight to the nearest police station. The hours that followed were a whirlwind of interrogations, questions, and memories that I myself wanted to erase. The kidnappers had fled before the authorities arrived, but the policeman managed to recover my friend's body in that cabin. Seeing his body, covered with a sheet in the morgue, was like reliving every second of that night. The storm, the screams, the last moment I saw him alive. Even after the days and weeks, that image remained stuck in my mind. The authorities explained to me that everything pointed to a failed plan. The kidnappers, according to the investigations, were planning to demand a ransom, but my friend's escape attempt had destabilized them, leading to brutality and chaos. I survived, yes, but that experience became a permanent shadow, a scar in my memory from which I could never escape. Today, every time I hear the rumbling of a storm, every time the wind blows as it did that night, I relive the terror, the horror of being a witness and survivor of something that should never have happened. The trip to my parents' town had been long and tedious. The road, winding and dark, stretched out in front of me on a night of incessant rain. The windshield was a thin shield between me and the outside world, which seemed to be engulfed in a dense, gloomy fog. I could barely see the lights on the road, and fatigue was beginning to weigh on my eyelids. The clock on the dashboard read 2 o'clock in the morning, and I still had more than 2 hours to get home. I had no choice but to look for a place to rest a little before continuing on my way. In the middle of that desolate road, I found a modest hotel, whose twinkling lights seemed like a welcome sign in the middle of the darkness. The place didn't promise much. A 2-story building with worn paint and signs indicating that it was a transient lodging. At another time, perhaps, I would have moved on without looking twice, but my exhaustion was such that any place seemed adequate. As I parked, I noticed that the parking lot was almost empty, except for a couple of old cars that were barely distinguishable in the rain. The reception desk was small and dingy, with a counter that looked as old as the building itself. As I checked in, I noticed the face of the receptionist, a serious-looking man with a vacant stare and a grim expression. He handed me my key and showed me to my room on the 2nd floor, at the end of a dark hallway. The room was nothing special. A simple bed, a small table, and a window through which you could barely see the rain falling relentlessly. I collapsed on the bed, exhausted, and soon fell into a deep sleep, lulled by the incessant pounding of the water. A loud bang tore me out of sleep in the middle of the night. Startled, I tried to distinguish what had happened, but the only thing I could hear was the sound of the rain hitting hard. I remained motionless for a few minutes, listening in the gloom of the room, while my mind tried to find a rational explanation. But silence took over the place again. I could only hear the slow, heavy breathing of my own bewilderment. After a while, I decided to get up and see if there was any sign of activity in the hotel. When I opened the door to the room, the hallway was in darkness, illuminated only by a flickering lamp that seemed to cast eerie shadows. I descended the stairs, each step echoing in the silence. Everything seemed deserted. A strange foreboding began to grow within me, a subtle fear that I could not ignore. Arriving at the reception desk, the atmosphere was even gloomier than I remembered. The dim light barely illuminated the counter, but just enough to show something that immediately drew me back. Behind the counter, the receptionist lay on the floor, his body motionless, his eyes open and a frozen expression of surprise on his face. The pale color of his skin and the dark spot on his chest confirmed what I feared. He was dead. My heart began to pound, and a shiver ran down my spine. The metallic smell in the air was unmistakable. I looked around, searching for some sign of movement, some explanation for what had happened. But the place was silent, as if time had stopped. There was no sign of anyone else, no trace to suggest who might have done it. Only the body of the receptionist and the echo of my own breathing resonating in the stillness. Despair began to take hold of me. I tried to use the reception phone to call the police, but the line was dead. My cell phone, as if in a cruel irony, had no signal in the middle of that storm. I felt trapped, as if the hotel had become a death trap from which I could not escape. As the minutes passed, the initial adrenaline gave way to a more controlled panic. I remembered that I had seen a payphone on the other side of the parking lot when I arrived, so without thinking twice, I decided to get out and run there. Never mind the rain or the darkness, I just needed to call for help. I ran to the front door and, as I opened it, the rain hit me hard, soaking me instantly. The parking lot lights were barely illuminated, casting long, distorted shadows that made everything seem even more sinister. I reached the payphone, my hands shaking as I tried to dial the emergency number. This time, luckily, I got through. On the other end of the line, a professional voice asked me to explain what had happened. I tried to relate the facts as quickly as possible, omitting the terror that was invading me. The operator assured me that they would send a patrol car as soon as possible. I hung up the phone, and at that instant, a strange sensation ran through me. I was not alone. As I turned around, I saw a shadow move across the parking lot near the hotel entrance. The figure faded into the darkness before I could make out who or what it was, but just knowing that someone else was there made me feel more vulnerable than ever. The killer could still be in the hotel, hiding, watching me, and that filled me with indescribable fear. I hurried back to my room, closed the door and locked it. I stood motionless, listening, waiting for the sound of the patrol. Every minute seemed eternal. Every shadow that the rain cast on the walls seemed like a threat. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I heard the distant sound of sirens approaching. The police had arrived, and the relief I felt was immediate. I cautiously descended the stairs and saw 2 officers enter the hotel. I explained everything I had seen, how I had found the receptionist, and my suspicion that someone was still in the building. The agents searched the place while I waited in the lobby. One of them returned shortly thereafter, confirming the death of the receptionist, and mentioned that they had found signs of a struggle in the reception area. They informed me that apparently the killer had tried to steal money from the cash register before being caught, and in the struggle, the receptionist lost his life. But the worst thing was that they had no idea where the perpetrator was. Muddy footprints on the floor suggested that someone had escaped, getting lost in the darkness of the night. That early morning, I found myself wondering if the killer had been watching me the whole time, from some corner of the hotel, waiting for the right moment to act. That feeling of vulnerability, of being at the mercy of someone so cruel and dangerous, did not leave me, even when the officers escorted me out of the hotel. With the first ray of sunlight, I left that place, leaving behind the memory of a terrifying night that, even today, lingers in my memory like an indelible shadow. The rain was falling with a merciless, incessant fury, as if someone had opened the floodgates of the sky with no intention of closing them. I was running down the street with no clear destination, just looking for some shelter, some roof that would keep me away from the storm that was raging above me. My shoes were completely soaked, and the icy water seeped through my coat, embracing me with an uncomfortable humidity that chilled me to the bone. Then I saw it, a small, unassuming bar with a red neon sign that flashed in a slow, unhumored rhythm. It was a place that, in another situation, I would have passed by. The light inside seemed dim, the windows dingy, and the old wooden door was splintered and broken at the bottom. However, in that storm, any shelter was good. I entered without thinking too much. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, laden with a smell of mustiness, alcohol, and stale tobacco. A forgotten place in some corner of the city, where the walls seemed to absorb secrets and smoke was embedded in the worn wallpaper. Barely a couple of people were at the tables in the back, their gazes elusive, absorbed in their own worlds. All around me, all was gloom, barely interrupted by a lamp at the other end of the bar. I advanced to the bar and sat on a cracked leather stool, grateful at least for shelter from the storm. I ordered a double scotch, wanting to feel the burn in my throat and lungs, anything to remind me that I was at least out of the cold. As I drank in silence, I tried to ignore the clatter of the water hitting the windows and the gusts of wind that shook the door every so often. But then, without realizing it, I noticed a presence beside me. A man had slid onto the stool next to mine, with the staggering gait and sunken eyes of someone long sunk in the bottle. The first thing I caught was the smell, a sour mixture of old alcohol, sweat, and something more metallic, like rust. My instincts told me to ignore him, not to make eye contact, but something about him compelled me to watch him out of the corner of my eye. He was a middle-aged man with hard, sharp features, and his eyes, which seemed plunged in darkness, had a disturbing glint in them, a cold intensity that contrasted with his relaxed expression. He looked like a man of the street, one of those who went unnoticed in daylight, but whose face could be a ghost at night. The guy started talking, more to himself than to me, and each word, though washed out by drunkenness, carried a weight, a tinge of repressed violence. As he drank, he was pouring out stories, fragments of confessions that seemed to want to break free from his mind, as if the alcohol was opening a door to something dark that had been locked away for some time. He was talking about people. People who, he said, deserved what he had done to them. His stories were fragmentary and veiled, but there was no doubt in his tone, a kind of icy calm that made it clear that he was not joking, nor was he repentant. He said he had learned to detect that kind of people, those who had an air of weakness, of submission, as if they bore the stamp of predestined victims on their foreheads. He did not give specific details, only insinuations, vague descriptions of their encounters. He spoke of punishments and settling of scores, of nocturnal encounters in lonely places where no one could hear a muffled scream in the rain. He would pause every now and then, as if tasting his own memories, with a slight shudder that caused me a mixture of repulsion and fascination. As he spoke, my mind tried to rationalize what I was hearing, trying to convince myself that he was just a drunk man, telling made-up stories, trying to impress. But fear would break through, a slimy feeling that would wash over me and tell me that something in his words was real. The way he stared into the void, as if reliving every instant, told me he wasn't improvising. The man continued talking, more and more focused on details, on processes. He said he preferred to act on rainy days, when the sound of the water drowned out the noises, when the streets were deserted and passers-by disappeared. The rain, he said, was his ally, a faithful accomplice that erased traces and diluted any trace. My body tensed when I noticed his gaze drifting to me, as if he had sensed my discomfort. I tried to avoid his gaze, to pretend I wasn't paying attention to him, but his presence was like a shadow clinging to my side. I didn't dare move or ask for the check. Any gesture that broke the silence seemed like a provocation to me, something that might trigger a reaction from him. Then, he began to talk about one of his recent experiences. She did it in a lower tone, as if it were a secret to be shared in whispers. He described how he had come across a man who fit his profile, someone walking alone on a rainy night, like me. Someone who seemed to just be in the wrong place. He told how he had followed him, how he had approached unnoticed, enjoying every step that shortened the distance. He described the details with such precision that my mind drew the scene involuntarily, almost as if I were the prey in his tale. He spoke to me as if he knew me, as if he understood my fears, my thoughts, and his words were sharp knives that tore at what little courage I had left. By the time he finished his story, I was paralyzed. The idea of getting up and running away seemed almost absurd. I was certain that if I did, he would follow me, just as he had done with the people in his stories. I knew that, like them, I would become part of one of his stories, a fragment of his dark memory. As he continued talking, my mind began to search for ways out, for any strategy that could help me escape without provoking him. I felt every second like a cutting edge on my skin, the certainty that I was caught in his web without having planned it, a piece in his macabre game. The rain was still coming down hard outside, and in that dark and lonely bar, the only certainty was that if I didn't move soon, I would end up becoming the next link in their chain of stories. As the man continued to speak with his slurred voice and dark gaze, I felt a slight tremor in my coat pocket. It was my phone, a spark of hope. I slid my hand out slowly, trying not to attract his attention, and pulled out my cell phone. I pretended to check the time, but in reality, I was looking for my brother's number. With trembling fingers, I sent a short, desperate message indicating the address of that bar and to come and get me urgently. The minutes that followed were the longest of my life. I felt that my own breathing might give me away, and the words of the stranger who kept telling his macabre stories echoed like a threat that was getting closer and closer. Every second seemed to bring the danger closer. Every detail he gave seemed like a warning that became personal. Finally, the sound of the door opening made me jump involuntarily. I turned my head and saw my brother standing there, wet from the storm, but with an expression of steadfastness and determination. I stood up without looking at the man, trying to remain calm. "There you are," I said aloud, turning to my brother, as if our meeting was something casual. I felt the stranger's gaze boring into my back, and a chill ran through me as we walked toward the exit. When we stepped outside, the relief was like the first breath after being submerged in deep water. Without looking back, we got into the car and my brother drove off in silence, respecting the fear in my eyes. From the window, I watched the bar drive away in the rain, leaving that disturbing shadow behind. That night, the rain continued to fall, but it would no longer reach me. The rain was relentless that day. The sky seemed to be covered by a stormy blanket that darkened the atmosphere until I felt completely alone. I was going to the cemetery with a weight on my chest, heavier than usual, as if I knew something was about to happen. Water fell in thick drops, forming rivulets on the dirt paths that led to the grave of my twin brother, my other half, my lost reflection. Almost a year had passed since we buried him, yet the pain remained fresh. I knew I was not ready to lose him, as if life had ripped away a fundamental part of me, leaving a void that only in that cemetery could fill, even if only in appearance. The image of his tombstone, with his name engraved in stone, hurt me more than I dared to admit. Silently, I stood in front of it, watching the raindrops slide down the carved letters, wishing it was all a mistake, a dream from which I would wake up when I got home. The wind whistled through the trees, and an inexplicable coldness came over me, different from what I felt at other times. Somehow, that day, sadness was mixed with a strange feeling, almost of vigilance. In the distance, I could perceive a figure among the tombstones, someone who seemed to be standing, motionless, as if he were also visiting someone. But there was something in his posture, in the way he leered at me, that put me on my guard. Minutes passed, and I tried to concentrate on my thoughts, on the memory of my brother, and the comfort of knowing that, somehow, I was still honoring him. But the man's presence was still there, like a sticky shadow at the edge of my vision. Every now and then I would glance at him, noticing how little by little he seemed to approach, with a calculated slowness, one step, then another, as if each movement was measured so as not to disturb me, although he had already succeeded. A knot of discomfort settled in my stomach. It wasn't the first time I had seen someone in the cemetery, but something about this man was different. He approached me with a cold determination, unflinching, with a steady gaze that I was unable to turn away. My heart began to pound as I tried to understand the reason for his presence, the reason for the attention he was giving me. It occurred to me that perhaps he was confusing me with someone else, but that assumption crumbled when I saw that, even when he was only a few steps away from me, there was not the slightest hint of doubt in his gaze. He knew perfectly well who I was. Panic invaded me. I thought of backing away, of getting out of there without looking back, but something held me in place. There was something unsettling about his expression, a mixture of anxiety and determination that seemed beyond a simple misunderstanding. I didn't know whether to run or stay, and as my mind debated between these two options, he stopped right in front of me. He didn't speak, but his eyes said more than I was willing to accept. There was something in that look that stirred me inside, something familiar, and at the same time, deeply disturbing. Despite not remembering having seen that man in my life, his face was strangely familiar to me, as if somewhere in my memory his image existed, engraved in a forgotten corner of my childhood. I could not put my finger on it, but his presence was like a shadow of a past I had never come to understand. My hands were cold. The awkwardness of the situation was heightened by the silence that followed every glance we exchanged. My mind began to work in the background, remembering things, connecting loose threads, vague memories of my childhood, fuzzy faces, whispers that didn't quite form complete words, and suddenly, something clicked. It was like a bolt of lightning in the middle of the darkness. I understood that the man in front of me was not a stranger, but a shadow of something deeper, of a story I was never told. As the man moved forward and dropped a few words, the pieces of that puzzle began to assemble in a way I would never have imagined. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, but now the cold was different. My body was frozen not only by the water, but by the discovery of what had really happened. This man, the very man I had avoided out of fear, was my father. He had been absent all my life, an absence marked by silence and misinformation from those who raised me. He was the real reason for my incomplete existence, for that inexplicable emptiness. His confession was coming together in my mind like a puzzle. He told me about a fatal incident, an accident that had shattered my real mother, an event of tragedy and horror that had marked her life and changed the course of mine without my knowing anything about it. That was why he had disappeared. He had spent years in prison, paying for something that had not been premeditated but still cost my mother her life. The parents who had raised me, the ones I had called Mom and Dad throughout my childhood, were actually strangers who had intervened to give me a normal life, to hide the truth from me. The shock of this revelation was indescribable. It was as if my very being was broken into pieces, and every part of my life would now appear as an elaborate lie to protect me from a past that was now crushing me. I felt tears mingle with the rain, but I was unable to distinguish whether I was crying from sadness, rage, or sheer terror at what I had just discovered. This man, my father, someone I had never heard from in my entire life, was actually a figure as real and terrifying as the worst monster I could imagine. In his eyes there was no evil. There was a dry, deep pain, the pain of someone who had lost the person he loved and had been separated from his children by that very event. But that knowledge brought me no comfort. It only left me with a feeling of unease that tightened my chest and made me short of breath. At the end, when he left, I stood at the grave of my brother, the only person I really trusted. I felt betrayed, as if my own story had been ripped from my hands. The rain continued to fall, and at that moment I understood that the truth, far from bringing me peace, had condemned me to live with the uncertainty of who I really was, which part of my life was true and which had been a mere illusion. The university was for me the beginning of a new life, an opportunity to leave behind the days of monotony in the village and, above all, to start building a future. I had no great expectations, but I had arrived with the illusion of starting from scratch, surrounded by strangers, and with the freedom of living in a different place. It didn't take me long to find a house, somewhat neglected, but close enough to campus to be convenient. The house belonged to an older, tired-looking man with a vacant look. For the price he was offering me and the proximity to the university, it seemed like a good deal. At first, the quiet of the house was perfect for my studies. I got used to the creaking of the old wood under my feet, to the walls that seemed to rustle with every gust of wind, and to the shade of the trees that covered most of the windows, allowing the sun's rays to filter through for just a few minutes a day. As the months passed, the landlord allowed me to sublet the next room, a forgotten room down the hall, barely furnished, but suitable for someone else. The offer suited me. The rent would be cheaper, and perhaps the company would make the loneliness of the nights more bearable. That's when Gabriel arrived. He was a quiet guy, tall and thin, with dark eyes that seemed to look right through you. I was not uncomfortable with his presence, at least not at first. His silence could be interpreted as simple introversion. We barely crossed paths in the house, and the few encounters were brief. After a while, however, small details began to disturb me. I heard footsteps in the early morning echoing in the hallway, and several times I caught him staring at me from the gloom of the living room, with that deep, expressionless gaze that seemed to pierce my thoughts. One night in October, the rain began to fall in a torrential downpour, flooding the streets and drenching the atmosphere with a humidity that felt oppressive. I was locked in my room trying to concentrate on a rehearsal when I heard footsteps outside my room. The whole house was plunged into a thick silence, and those footsteps broke the calm abruptly. I knew Gabriel was there. His movements had a strange, irregular rhythm, as if he deliberately paused outside my door before continuing to the bathroom or kitchen. I convinced myself that these were just my ideas, but Gabriel's presence began to transform into something unsettling, a shadow that loomed over my life in that house. As the days went by, I noticed changes in the house that were inexplicable. Doors that I left closed appeared ajar, my things were in disarray, and on several occasions, I found objects I didn't recognize, things that didn't belong to either of us. I felt trapped in a web of small disturbances that seemed intentional, almost as if someone was playing with me. My sleep began to be affected. I would wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling of being watched, and often heard whispers that seemed to come from Gabriel's room. That tension grew until it reached its climax one stormy night when the rain never seemed to stop. I remember lying in my bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to fall asleep, when suddenly I heard a dull sound, a thud echoing down the hallway. I sat up, immobilized by a sense of alarm. I was sure that something had fallen, but I could not discern what. The rain was pattering loudly on the windows, and the thunder seemed to emphasize my growing anxiety. I got up and, without turning on the light, opened my bedroom door to peek out into the hallway. It was completely dark, except for the faint illumination of a street lamp that cast distorted shadows through the windows. It was then that I saw a figure at the end of the hallway, near the entrance to the kitchen. Although it was dark, I could make out Gabriel, who stood motionless, staring at me. A shiver ran through me. There was no reason for me to be there, let alone in complete darkness. Without making a sound, I withdrew and closed the door, trying to think of a rational explanation. But minutes passed, and I kept hearing movements outside, his footsteps, his barely perceptible breathing behind the thin door. The situation became unbearable. I felt cornered, and every second that passed made me imagine darker and darker scenarios. Time seemed to stand still until I heard something that chilled my blood. A metallic sound, soft, like the click of a knife being opened. My mind began to wander, and fear paralyzed me. My only option was to get out, to escape from that room and Gabriel's threatening presence. I decided to wait for the storm to die down, but then I heard someone fiddling with my doorknob. Tense fingers and subtle noises confirmed what I had feared. Gabriel was outside, trying to open the door. Desperation overcame me, and in a burst of impromptu bravery, I blocked the door with a chair. It was at that instant that I heard him mutter something, a barely audible whisper that filtered through the door. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but his tone, low and sinister, suggested something dark, as if he were hatching a plan to harm me. The minutes that followed were psychological torture. His every move, his every attempt to open the door, resounded like an impending sentence. Suddenly, everything was silent. I could hear nothing, not even breathing. I thought he was gone, that maybe it had all been a cruel joke, a sick manifestation of his disturbing personality. But then the sound of his voice came flooding back into the hallway, this time with a firmer tone. That whisper turned into clear, icy words, spoken just outside my door. My heart was beating so loudly that it seemed impossible that Gabriel could not hear it from the other side. I couldn't stay there all night, but fear prevented me from even moving. Then I heard a loud noise, as if something was breaking. I turned my head and saw that the window of my room was open, and an icy air was coming into the room. In the middle of that storm, I saw a shadow moving towards the street. Gabriel was walking away in the rain, walking with the same disturbing calm with which he had tormented me. I watched him disappear into the darkness, not knowing what had prompted his sudden retreat, but feeling that the nightmare had come to an end. The next morning, still feeling uneasy in my body, I decided to call the police and tell them what had happened. I had not slept at all. Gabriel's face and his presence in the hallway continued to haunt me like a dark shadow. When the patrol car arrived, the officers listened to my story with an increasingly serious expression. They asked me to enter the house to inspect Gabriel's room, and what they found only increased my anxiety. Among his things, they found several fake IDs and other people's personal items, photos, clothes, and small objects that had no explanation. But the most disturbing thing was the comment one of the officers made to me on the way out. "We have been looking for him. Gabriel has been linked to several cases of disappearances and murders in other cities. He is an extremely dangerous man." That revelation hit me like a bucket of ice water. In that instant, I understood the real danger I had been in for weeks, sharing a roof with a man capable of atrocities I could barely imagine. Every haunting look, every step in the night, every tense moment took on new meaning. I felt a chill on the back of my neck as I realized how close I had come to becoming one of his victims. As the officers walked away, a strange relief washed over me, but also a deep horror as I realized that, on that stormy night, I had come face to face with a real monster. I never thought something like this could happen to me. I, who had always felt confident meeting people through Tinder, felt comfortable and confident in the process. After all, everyone likes a little adventure, meeting someone new, going out for a drink, or just chatting. However, nothing I had experienced before prepared me for what happened that night. Mariana appeared in my life like any other girl, a light conversation, a few exchanges of photos and messages, and an invitation to go out. She didn't seem anything out of the ordinary. She had something in her profile that caught my attention. The way she expressed herself, the way she wrote. He struck me as someone interesting, different. At first, the conversations were quiet, casual, nothing too intense. I didn't usually get too excited, but there was something about her that made my thoughts get caught between each message. Finally, we agreed to meet. The night of the meeting came faster than I expected. Mariana told me that she would be home alone, that her sister would be out partying, and we would have the house to ourselves. It sounded perfect to me. We talked about doing it in her neighborhood, a place that seemed quiet, if somewhat secluded. "It will be fun," she told me in one of the last messages before we stopped talking to meet up. When I arrived in the neighborhood, something made me feel uncomfortable, but I couldn't identify it right away. At first, it was just the rain. The storm had arrived earlier than expected, covering the sky with a dark blanket that foreshadowed something else. The place was lonely, very still. Houses that looked abandoned, empty streets. Not a single person was in sight, and the streetlights flickered intermittently, as if struggling to stay lit. Despite the drizzle, a cold sweat began to break out on my forehead. I followed Mariana's instructions, who directed me through messages to a specific house, a house that seemed different from the others, The house was somewhat old, one of those that have seen better days. The garden, overgrown with weeds, extended towards a front door that was ajar, which seemed strange to me. But I tried to ignore it. I was already there, and everything seemed to be under control. From a distance, the house even looked cozy, as if the storm and neglect might simply be irrelevant details. As I parked the car in front of the entrance, an uneasy feeling swept over me. The first drops of rain began to hit the windshield hard. I looked toward the house and for an instant thought about turning around, but something held me back. I didn't know if it was my ego, my desire to meet Mariana, or simply the fact that I had come so far, I couldn't turn back. I decided to get out of the car. It was then that I knew, when the pressure in my chest grew unbearable. 3 men came out of nowhere, like shadows emerging from the fog. I hadn't seen them coming. They were there, just a few steps away from me, surrounding the entrance of the house, staring with an intensity that left me in no doubt. My mind began to race, looking for reasons, excuses, anything that could make me think that all this was just a bad coincidence, a misunderstanding. The first blow came quickly and unexpectedly. I didn't see it coming. A metal pipe impacted hard on my back and pain shot through my body like an electric current. I staggered forward, but before I could react, the other 2 men pushed me to the ground, kicking me again and again in fury. I tried to get up, to scream, but the pain and the metallic taste of blood in my mouth made it difficult to move. The blows were relentless, a beating that seemed to have no end. Through the pain and confusion, I tried to think. I tried to scream for help, but the rain and wind drowned everything out. I knew there was no one around, that I could count on no one to save me. My breathing became choppy, and my vision began to blur. The rain continued to fall, washing over the scene with its persistent noise, but it didn't calm me. I couldn't understand how I had gotten here. All I knew was that there was no turning back. Somehow I managed to roll over on my back, looking for something to defend myself with. Something, anything. But there was nothing. My mind, as the darkness took hold of me, began to wander. I remembered the house, the address, the conversations. What had happened? Why hadn't I seen the signs? Why hadn't I listened to the warning that my instinct had been screaming at me all along? The feeling of vulnerability was deeper than any physical pain. I had risked too much, trusting in something as fragile as a stranger's promise. But the damage had already been done. After taking my wallet and a few bills I had in my pockets, the men walked away. My mind was too foggy to understand what had happened. The blows, the violence, the fear. Everything was mixed in a kind of thick fog that enveloped me, preventing me from thinking clearly. I could feel the rain soaking my clothes, the cold and slippery ground, but my body seemed to be in automatic mode, as if one part of me was trying to cling to life while the other had already given in to pain and despair. My vision was blurry and every breath was like a struggle, but for some reason my mind managed to stay focused on one thing: the car. My car, which I had left parked there just a few steps from the house. With a titanic effort, I began to crawl towards the vehicle. The pain with every movement was unbearable, but I did not stop. I knew that if I stayed there, if I didn't do something, I would not survive. I was in a desolate neighborhood, with no one around, with no hope that anyone would help me at that moment. The rain kept falling, and the sound of the water hitting the asphalt made me feel even more isolated, more alone in that place that, somehow, had been my mistake. When I finally got to the car, I struggled to open the door. My hands were clumsy, full of pain. Seeing my phone on the seat, a glimmer of hope crossed my mind. I picked it up with trembling hands. It didn't matter if it was wet. I turned it on, and with difficulty dialed the emergency number. The sound of the call was the only thing that could be heard in my ears, accompanying the steady pattering of the rain on the roof of the car. "What is your emergency?" The voice on the other end of the phone sounded far away, almost as if it were in another world. I couldn't speak properly, but I did my best to explain what had happened. I said something about 3 men, an assault, that I was beaten, that I couldn't breathe, that I needed help. I felt my throat close up, but I still repeated my location. It took a few minutes for the police to respond, but in that time, my head felt like it was about to explode from so much pain. Time passed slowly, much slower than I would like to have experienced. Every second that passed was one more blow against my will, a feeling of helplessness that embraced me and would not leave me. The men had taken what they wanted, but I had been left with more than just physical pain. My mind, at first troubled, began to make connections that I did not fully understand. Why had I been so blind? Why hadn't I listened to the warnings my instinct was giving me all the time? Mariana, where was she? What was really going on? The police arrived later, though not as quickly as I would have liked. When I finally saw the lights of the patrol cars approaching, I felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. Someone was finally there to help me, but I also knew there was something else behind it all, something I couldn't fully understand. As the officers approached, they helped me out of the car and sat me on the sidewalk, surrounded by the flashing lights of the patrol cars and the steady rain. The pain was still excruciating, but the presence of the police officers gave me a minimal sense of security. As they attended to me, I tried to explain what had happened, to tell them about the men, about Mariana, and the strange neighborhood. My head was still half functioning, but I told them what I remembered. One of the officers looked at me with a grave, almost serious expression, as if something did not fit my story. They asked me a few more questions, but the truth is that I could not remember many details. My mind was collapsing under the weight of pain and anguish. It was then that one of the officers mentioned something that made my blood run cold. He said that the site has been linked to several petty crimes in recent months, and they have received reports of a criminal gang operating in the area. My stomach twisted in a twist of horror. Mariana. Everything suddenly fit together. The house, the neighborhood, the situation. It was all part of a bigger plan, something far more sinister than I had imagined. Mariana had been a piece in all of it. The officers looked at me, probably noticing my panicked expression. They said, "You've probably walked into a trap, my friend. This kind of thing is not new in that area. But luckily, we've been able to dismantle some of their operations." I could feel the weight of the truth hitting me hard. Not only had I been the victim of a robbery, but I had been on the verge of becoming something much worse. The men who attacked me were probably just a piece of something much bigger, something much more dangerous. And Mariana, now I understood that she had been nothing more than a decoy, a front to lure me into her deadly game. I was taken to the hospital in an ambulance, the flashing light and sirens cutting through the dark night as my body continued to protest with each jolt. My broken ribs felt like a constant reminder of the danger I had faced, but despite the stabbing pain in my chest, I felt strange somehow. Lucky. Fortunately, I had not lost my life that night, although the feeling of closeness with death would haunt me for a long time. The doctors attended to me quickly. They took several x-rays and finally informed me that I had several fractured ribs. These were not minor injuries, but fortunately, there was no serious internal damage. I was relieved by the diagnosis, but also scarred by the experience. Nothing would ever be the same again. As I lay in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but think about how it had all happened so fast, how I had fallen into the trap, into the idea of meeting someone from an app, without thinking about what might really be behind that screen. Later that night, when I was able to grab my phone, I decided to uninstall Tinder. It was an action I had been putting off since the police had told me about the neighborhood and the gangs involved. But in the end, uninstalling was more than just a gesture. It was a commitment to myself to never put myself in a situation like that again, to not allow my curiosity or need to meet people to drag me back into that kind of risk. I decided that my safety and well-being were worth more than any superficial encounter, more than the possibility of meeting someone new. I never went out with strangers again. That episode taught me a hard but necessary lesson. The adrenaline of fear became a kind of internal warning, something that kept me alert. I knew that, in the world, people are not always what they seem, and behind every profile, every message, there might be something dark waiting to catch you. From that day on, I made a decision that would change my life forever. My safety came first, and I would not let the search for connections blind me to the real danger. The rain was a wall separating me from everything. That night, each falling drop hit like a reminder, a litany that brought me back to the darkest days of my life. Because from then on, the rain stopped being just water and became a constant reminder of loss, of a pain that understands neither logic nor time. Every storm dragged me to that same corner of darkness, to that abyss where silence was a sharp blade and the echo of thunder, the cries of the injustice that haunted me. I had met Clara on a random night, one of those nights when you don't think much about the future or the consequences. She was a woman with an enveloping smile and a look that seemed to speak of places and adventures that no one else could access. We had nothing in common, but sometimes that's all you need to get carried away. What was ours was not love. It was barely fleeting, an encounter that left an indelible mark. I saw her as someone to hang out with, someone to whom I could entrust a part of my loneliness and receive, in return, a night of relief. However, that night turned into something else, something much deeper, and without knowing it, something devastating. A few months later, Clara called me with a voice between clipped and nervous. She told me she was pregnant. The impact hit me like lightning. We were not a couple. We did not share a future. But there was that life, forming, something I could no longer ignore. My mind filled with confusion, but one certainty broke through. I was not going to leave my son. I took responsibility for that child as if it had been planned, as if I had always wanted to hold him in my arms. In spite of everything, I was determined to be a good father, to be present, to take care of him, to love him. I couldn't tell if Clara was as committed as I was. Her free and impulsive character didn't quite fit her new life. I often noticed her absent, distant, and in those moments, instinct told me that she hadn't given up her old life, that she was still searching for the nights of freedom that the sun had taken away from her. But I tried to ignore those signs, convinced that I would succeed in protecting our son. I kept telling myself that the love I felt for him would be enough to make things right. I was wrong. It was one of those stormy nights, like this one that has me now imprisoned in my own house, isolated in my thoughts. That night, Clara had decided to go out. She had mentioned it to me, I think, but I was stuck at work, reviewing documents until the wee hours. Time was slipping through my fingers, and although my intuition told me I should go home, a myriad of responsibilities kept me tied to my desk. I never even questioned whether I should stay home. Maybe I trusted that I was clear about what it meant to be a mother. Maybe I just didn't think about the risk. I assumed that any mother, no matter how distracted, would protect her child. But in Clara, there was a reckless streak, a constant urge to want to escape. By the time I finished at the office, the storm had already begun to roll in. I remember the rumbling of the thunder as I drove home, and the urgency I felt to check on my son, to make sure he was okay. It was a deep anguish, tightening my chest and quickening my breathing. It wasn't until I arrived that I noticed Clara's missed call on my phone. I tried to call her back several times, but she didn't answer. The storm was drowning out the signal, and the sound of the rain pounding on the roof made it hard to concentrate on anything else. But there was an uneasiness beginning to well up, a kind of dark foreboding that enveloped me with each passing second. In the meantime, I tried to convince myself that it was just a senseless feeling. I thought that perhaps Clara had left the child with a nanny, or that she was simply temporarily out of reach. However, the knot in my stomach was getting tighter and tighter, and the pain of not knowing was burning me. It was in those hours of uncertainty that the news came that changed my life forever. A police officer knocked on my door. Somehow I knew he didn't bring good news, but never in my worst nightmares would I have imagined what I was about to hear. The storm outside seemed to echo in my head as the officer spoke. My son, the child I had promised to take care of, had been found lifeless in Clara's house. An intruder had broken in during the night while she was away. A random man, a thief who had sneaked in during the storm, ignorant and ruthless. The officer explained to me that the thief had heard my son crying. In his attempt to silence him so as not to be discovered, he suffocated him. My little son had died, a victim of irrational violence, of the negligence of a mother who that night preferred to escape from the life she had brought into the world. I don't remember how long I stood still after receiving the news. The reality was so brutal that my mind refused to accept it completely. That night, the storm was not just a background sound. It was a symbol of everything I had lost. I lay in the darkness of my room, unable to sleep, unable to think, unable to comprehend. Since then, every storm is a torture, a reminder that life took my son from me on a night when someone decided his life was worth no more than the pleasure of an outing. In the days that followed, I felt I was walking in darkness. Life went on around me. People went on with their routines. Days went by. But for me, time had lost all meaning. Every time I tried to close my eyes, I saw his face, the face of my son, innocent, fragile, taken away from this life before even understanding it. I was tormented by the knowledge that in his last moments he must have been afraid, that he cried, that he needed me, and I was not there to protect him. I tried to find answers. I tried to understand how someone could have so little compassion, how someone could do something so inhuman. I looked for explanations in the police reports, in Clara's statement, in every fragment of information that could give me a reason. But there were no reasons, only a dreadful and cruel coincidence, a fateful encounter between chance and the recklessness of a mother who had abandoned her child on the worst of nights. Every storm since then brings me back to that moment. The rain turns to tears, the rumble of thunder to the despair I feel inside. On rainy nights, I feel the storm haunting me. The memories come back to envelop me like a thick fog, reminding me of what I can no longer change, what I can never get back. The sound of the rain on the roof becomes an echo that reminds me every second of the hole left in my life. The memory of her face became a shadow that I cannot leave behind. No matter how much I try to move on, no matter how much I try to occupy my mind with other things, that image is always there, waiting for me in the gloom, like a weight that refuses to leave me. On stormy nights, when lightning fleetingly illuminates the darkness, I have the sensation of seeing him, of feeling his presence, of hearing his cry muffled by the storm. Perhaps someday this wound will become bearable. Perhaps in time, the image of his face will cease to haunt me, to appear in every corner of my mind. But in the meantime, every storm reminds me of the horror of a night I cannot erase, the pain of having lost what I loved most. Because the rain, since that night, stopped being just water and became an eternal lament that haunts me, that ties me to that last night when life, in an act of senseless brutality, took my son away from me. That night shift began like any other. The rain was pounding hard on the windshield as I drove through deserted streets, shrouded in a thick fog that made the atmosphere even gloomier. The lights of the patrol car reflected off the puddles, creating eerie glints in the darkness. It was a heavy night, the kind of night when time seems to stand still and a strange feeling comes over you. Something, deep down, told me that this would be a night to remember, though I didn't quite know why. The clock struck 3 in the morning when the radio broke the silence with an emergency call. The tone of the voice I received had a restrained urgency, and that was enough to make me tense my shoulders. It was an old house, in an almost abandoned area of the city. Someone had heard a strange scream, and the neighbors, though few, had called out in concern. I didn't expect to find anything too strange. Perhaps someone who had had too much to drink or a domestic disturbance, but the operator's voice made it clear that the call was unusual. I followed the road to that address, noticing how the lights of the city were fading as I entered the oldest and most neglected part of the neighborhood. The streets were empty, with a sense of abandonment that intensified in the storm. Finally, I arrived at the house, a grim-looking building, with peeling walls and windows that looked like they had seen better days. I got out of the patrol car and walked towards the door, feeling the weight of the rain soaking my jacket and the cold soaking my bones. There was something unusual in the air, a kind of pressure that made each step feel heavier than the last. When I reached the threshold, I noticed that the door was ajar, and a faint light was filtering in from inside, casting long shadows on the wet floor. I opened the door all the way, and as I entered, I was enveloped by a dense smell, a mixture of mildew and damp, with a slight metallic note that I found disturbing. The house was completely silent, except for the occasional creak of wood under my feet. I looked around and saw that the decor was old-fashioned, as if time had stood still decades ago. There was dust-covered furniture, pictures of unknown people hanging on the walls, and an antique clock that, oddly enough, showed the wrong time, stopped at 11:10. I continued to move forward, guided by the dim light coming from a room at the end of the hallway. Each step echoed in the silence, as if the whole house was paying attention to my presence. I reached the entrance to the room, and when I glanced in, I saw something that left me paralyzed. In the center of the room, dimly lit by a table lamp, was an elderly man, sitting in a chair with his head bent forward. The scene might have seemed harmless, even ordinary, were it not for the fact that there was something deeply disturbing about his posture. His head drooped to one side, and his hands were folded in his lap, holding an old black-and-white photograph of a young woman. The man did not move. The skin on his face had an unnatural pallor, and the eyes, though open, showed no signs of life. It was then that I noticed that his neck had a reddish line, as if it had been marked by a rope. The sight of that mark made me shudder, and a shiver ran down my spine. I moved a little further, and as I got closer, something crunched under my feet. Looking down, I saw a dark puddle extending from the base of the chair. Blood, thick and clotted, had formed a trail that seemed to have seeped from the wound on his neck. I took a deep breath, trying to control the urge to run away, and tried to take in the situation. The man had been there for some time, perhaps hours, maybe even days, although the fresh puddle indicated that something in that house was still alive in a disturbing way. I scanned the room with my eyes, and then I noticed it. On the wall, just behind the chair, there was something written in an irregular and clumsy handwriting, as if it had been traced in the dark. It was a word, or rather a name, written in large letters that seemed to have been painted with the same dark liquid that formed the puddle on the floor. I approached, and although the paint was already dry, the name was clearly visible. Emilia. I knew no Emilia, and yet the name seemed to echo in the air, as if the walls themselves were whispering it. The whole house seemed to breathe in a haunting murmur, and the echo of that word reverberated in my mind unbearably. Trying to shake off that feeling, I stepped back into the hallway, convinced that I should inspect the house more thoroughly. If there was someone else there, I had to find them. I walked silently, trying not to make a sound, but the creaking of the wood under my feet seemed to amplify each step. I reached the staircase leading to the second floor and, looking up, saw that the hallway was completely dark, as if the light avoided that corner of the house. I took a breath and began to climb, feeling how each step seemed to suck me deeper into the heart of the house. The darkness grew thicker with each step, and the sound of my breathing was the only indication that I was still there, that I had not been swallowed up by the void. As I reached the bottom step, a half-open door caught my attention. I pushed open the door and entered a room full of papers scattered everywhere, torn photographs and handwritten notes, as if someone had been desperately looking for something. On a table, a wooden box stood out among the clutter. It was old, carved with strange symbols that seemed to have some hidden meaning. When I opened it, I found several letters, all addressed to Emilia. They were love notes, heartbreaking letters written in increasingly desperate handwriting, as if the author had lost his mind. The tone of the letters changed, from romantic to obsessive, from loving to terrifying. Each word seemed imbued with an insane madness, an intense need that exceeded every limit. I realized that the man I found downstairs was no stranger to this house. He had probably spent his last days here, writing and rewriting those messages, caught in a spiral of obsession for someone who was no longer here. A gust of icy wind blew across the room, and all the cards lifted momentarily before falling to the floor. I looked up at the open window and saw my own reflection in the glass. But something about that reflection wasn't right. It wasn't my expression, but something in my eyes, a shadow I didn't recognize. At that moment, a sense of urgency hit me, and I knew I had to get out of there. As I turned toward the door, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were light, almost imperceptible, but the sound was clear in the silence. I stood still, sharpening my hearing. The footsteps stopped sounding outside the room. My heart began to pound, and I found myself wishing it was just my mind playing tricks on me. However, the weight of that presence was undeniable. It was as if the whole house had come alive and was watching me, waiting for me to take the next step. I didn't dare open the door right away. Instead, I stepped back, my eyes fixed on the entrance, feeling fear grip me in a way I had never experienced before. Finally, I plucked up my courage and stepped out into the hallway. To my surprise, it was empty, and the silence was so thick that it seemed to me that even the house was holding its breath. I hurried my steps, descending the stairs with the feeling that something or someone was following me closely. When I reached the first floor, I noticed that the light in the man's room had gone out. A shiver ran through my body, but I decided not to stop. I just wanted to get out of there, leave that house and never come back. As I went outside, I saw a dark figure in the window, a shadow that seemed almost unreal. Something inside me reacted like a spring. My police instinct, numbed by fear, resurfaced immediately. I stopped my march and reached for the radio. I could still feel the stare from the window, that enigmatic presence watching me silently. "I need backup at my location," I said, trying to make my voice sound steady despite the uneasiness that still coursed through my body. It didn't take long for them to respond, and within minutes, several patrol cars arrived on the scene. As the officers spread out around the house, I explained what I had seen: the lifeless body of the man in the chair, the letters addressed to Amelia, and finally that presence at the window. The atmosphere was tense, and the rain was still falling hard, deafening every other sound. We entered the house, this time accompanied, and went up to the second floor together. The agents searched every nook and cranny, moving papers and old furniture. It was in one of the back rooms that one of them uttered a warning in a low voice. Upon entering, I was confronted with a scene that could only be described as disturbing. A man in his late 30s, with a blank stare and pale face, was standing in the corner of the room, watching us without blinking. He was the dead man's son, we later confirmed. His mind had long since succumbed to an unfathomable darkness, trapped in that house with the memories of a woman who was no longer there, Amelia, his mother, whom he had apparently lost years ago. He lived in the shadows of the house, consumed by his father's obsession, in a silence so absolute that the neighbors barely knew of his existence. That night ended with the young man in custody, but his image remained etched in my mind like a shadow, a warning about the power of loneliness and abandonment. As I closed that case, I understood that some horrors don't need monsters or spirits. Sometimes human madness and emotional emptiness are enough to create the worst specters. It was a dense, humid night, the kind where the air seems soaked with something more than water. An intangible, sticky weight that soaks into the bones and makes the cold feel more vivid. The train station was almost deserted. The lights flickered on and off, reflecting their yellow, deathly hues on the wet asphalt. I had arrived ahead of schedule, wanting to avoid the last-minute nightmare. I knew the next exit would be a long time coming, but it didn't matter. He preferred the silence, the emptiness of the platforms. Or so he thought. The rain had been falling relentlessly for hours. The drops echoed on the metal roof of the station, on the pavement, on the leaves of the few trees that peeked through the buildings. Every sound seemed to be amplified in the darkness, and although the echo of the lonely station must have been soothing, I was beginning to feel uneasy. Perhaps it was the accumulation of sounds, or the way the light reflected off the puddles, creating strange shadows, but I couldn't shake an uneasiness that was beginning to creep into my mind. At first, I told myself that it was just my imagination, that the fatigue and the rain created that oppressive atmosphere, that the reason for the air to feel so heavy was simply the weather. But little by little I noticed something else, a kind of vibration in the atmosphere, a feeling that could not shake me. I looked around. The station was completely empty, just the way I liked it. There weren't even any watchmen or cleaners, just the dark wooden benches, the closed lockers, and the distant flicker of a security camera that probably hadn't worked for months. I tried to relax and take a deep breath, but I felt a strange pressure in my chest. That's when I saw it. He was at the end of the platform in a corner a few meters from a column. At first, he was just a blurred figure, a shadow among the shadows, but gradually his outlines began to define themselves. I could not see his face, for the light from the station barely reached him, but it was clear that he was looking at me. Motionless, standing in the rain that was falling harder and harder. I don't know how I knew he was watching me, as the distance and the darkness made it almost impossible, but I knew. It was a certainty that pierced me to the bone. I tried to look away, to pretend I hadn't noticed, but it was impossible. The figure was there, present in my every thought, filling every second with unease. I told myself that there was no reason to be alarmed, that it was just a random passerby waiting for the same train, someone who, like me, preferred not to draw attention to himself. And yet, every second that passed I felt him closer, even though he had not taken a single step. My gaze returned to him again and again, as if an invisible force was pushing me to do so. I noticed he was wearing a dark coat, long and worn, as if he had seen too many nights like that. His posture was stiff. Still, I couldn't see his face. The visor of his cap covered his eyes, casting an eerie shadow over the rest of his figure. It was as if his presence somehow absorbed what little light remained in the station. Minutes passed, and the train did not appear. Every second that passed made me feel more vulnerable, more exposed. The rain was pouring down, forming rivulets that meandered between the cobblestones and the tracks. In the distance, the sound of lightning broke the monotony of the falling drops, but it failed to distract me. The stranger was still there, immovable, like a lifeless statue. I clenched my fists and tried to concentrate on the sounds of my own breathing and the steady drip. There was no logical reason for the fear I felt. He hadn't done anything. He was just standing there looking at me. Or so I thought. But then something inside me told me that this man was no mere passerby. Something in his posture, in the way his shoulders slumped, relaxed and unstressed, suggested to me that he wasn't waiting for a train. The lights flickered again, and for an instant I could see his face. It was just a flash, a fraction of a second in which the light revealed strange features, too pale and with a special gleam in the eyes. I shuddered. I wanted to move, to take a few steps away from him, but my legs seemed to be anchored to the ground. It was as if an invisible force was holding me to the platform, forcing me to stay there, to endure his presence. I looked at the station clock. The train should have arrived 10 minutes ago. Weather delays, I thought, trying to calm myself, but that excuse only increased my anxiety, as if deep down inside I knew that this delay was just another detail in a series of unfortunate events that would culminate in something worse. Minutes passed, and the man was still there, unmoving. His eyes, or whatever he was hiding under the shadow of his cap, seemed to pierce me, stripping me of any attempt to rationalize the situation. I imagined how his footsteps would echo on the ground if he decided to approach. I wondered if I would hear his breathing as he approached, if there would be any change in his posture before he moved. But he wasn't doing any of that. He just stood there looking at me. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the station lights flickered again. For an instant, I thought they would go out completely, leaving me alone in the gloom with him. But they came on again, though less brightly, flickering in a sinister choreography that only increased my tension. I tried to convince myself that it was all a coincidence, that I was just exaggerating. But the fear did not subside. Rather, it seemed to grow, to multiply with every second that the man remained in his place, watching me from the shadows. I could feel it as a pressure in my chest, a tingling in my back, a pang of adrenaline that pushed me to flee, to run without looking back. But something inside me knew that if I did, that man would follow me. And then, there would be no turning back. I gritted my teeth and closed my eyes, trying to block out his presence, convincing myself that it was only my imagination. But when I opened them, the man was no longer where I had last seen him. My heart skipped a beat. Now, he was a few meters closer, under the dim light of another pole, still looking at me with the same intensity. It was as if the distance between us had disappeared in the blink of an eye, as if every time I looked away, he could move forward without being seen. I felt my body tense up, every muscle preparing for an escape that I didn't dare to initiate. Maybe if I ran. But I knew that would only make things worse. I forced myself to look at the clock one more time, as if the passing of the minutes could bring me back to calm, but each tick seemed like a taunt, a reminder that I was stuck on that lonely platform, in the rain, with a man who was getting closer and closer. The waiting became unbearable. Every second was torture. I could not look anywhere else without feeling his presence behind my thoughts. And as the minutes continued their slow march, I thought that night, there would be no train to take me back home. The clock ticked another minute. Every second felt like an eternity, and the echoing rain seemed to intensify, coating me in a layer of fear that I couldn't shake. But just as I was about to surrender to that sense of imminent danger, I heard something. It was a sound so faint that at first I thought it was just another distant clap of thunder. But no, it was a metallic rumbling coming from the tracks, a rumble that grew louder as it got closer. The train was coming at last. The light of the locomotive loomed in the distance, illuminating the platform with a warm, powerful glow that restored to me, if only momentarily, some sense of security. As I turned my head toward the place where the man had been, I saw him motionless, as if the arrival of the train had not the slightest impact on him. He was still there, with that same rigid posture and the gaze that I could no longer make out, but which I still felt fixed on me. The train stopped, and a group of passengers got off in a hurry, some running to escape the rain, others commenting with laughter and glances at the storm. It was an indescribable relief to see them, to hear their voices and feel the flow of people around me, bringing me back to the real world and taking away that unbearable oppression. Without hesitation, I boarded the train with them, feeling my heart pounding but relieved, as if I were leaving a nightmare behind. Once in the carriage, from the window, I observed the stranger once again. He was still standing on the platform, motionless in the rain. He did not make the slightest effort to board it. His figure faded into the shadows as the train started, and I understood that his purpose was not to board that train, but something much darker. As the train pulled away, an icy thought crossed my mind. Maybe that man would stay there, waiting, silently, until someone else arrived alone, vulnerable, in the rain. I never knew what his real intention was, if he just wanted to frighten me, or if he was looking for something else, something I dared not imagine. But as I felt the warmth of the carriage and surrounded by unfamiliar faces, I repeated to myself, almost like a prayer, that fortunately, that night, I had managed to escape. The rain was falling with overwhelming intensity, as if the sky had decided to unleash its fury on us. The drops were hitting the mud, creating a dull sound that drowned out any other noise. It was the darkest night I had ever experienced, and not just because of the storm. It was 2 a.m., and we were in the middle of a mission in hostile territory. Visibility was almost zero, and the piercing cold was chilling my bones. I was in a small trench soaked to the bone, with my rifle resting on the wet earth. The mud had taken over all around me, and my comrades were scattered, each in position, hoping that the storm would give us a break. But in this place, the storm was not only meteorological, it was a storm of war, a chaos we could smell in the air. Despite the noise of the rain, there was something that I perceived, a distant murmur that disturbed me. I strained to listen, trying to distinguish the sounds emerging from the roar of the water. Then I heard it. Gunshots. The sound was intermittent, like a distant echo, but it was getting closer. Adrenaline surged through my system, and my survival instincts kicked in. The storm seemed to intensify, and the bursts of gunfire became screams. The screams of my companions, mixed with the din of war, created a symphony of terror that paralyzed me. What was happening? Uncertainty filled me with panic. I knew I could not stay here, but the thought of going out in the open under enemy fire filled me with doubt. I decided I had to move. Carefully, I crawled through the mud, trying not to make any noise. My mind was in a maelstrom of thoughts. Was it my companions who were screaming? Was someone hurt? The rain didn't stop falling, and every step I took felt like another weight on my conscience. Bullets whistled around me, and the sound of gunfire grew louder and louder. I felt trapped in a nightmare, a labyrinth in which every choice could mean life or death. I managed to reach a higher position, a small knoll that gave me a better view of the battlefield. From there, I could see flashes of light in the distance, gunfire briefly illuminating the darkness. My heart was pounding as I tried to focus my eyes. Amidst the chaos, I saw silhouettes moving through the trees, figures gliding swiftly, like shadows in the night. The confusion was palpable. Were they friend or foe? The terrain was getting more and more slippery. I crawled to a safer place, but my mind could not stop thinking about my companions. Uncertainty was eating me up. War was not just about shooting and hiding. It was a mental game, a constant struggle against fear and despair. Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed to my right. My body tensed. I wasn't sure if it came from a friend or an enemy, but the terror was the same. The thought of losing someone, of not being able to do anything to help, filled me with helplessness. I knew I had to act. I began to move towards the sound, aware that every step was a risk. The rain was falling harder and the mud stuck to my boots, making my progress difficult. Every moment I thought I might be discovered, that a sniper might be watching me in the dark. Anxiety enveloped me, and adrenaline coursed through my veins. The sound of gunshots became closer and my heart was racing. I reached an area where the sound was clearer. Through the shadows I saw a group of soldiers, but they were not from my unit. They were enemy, and they were surrounding one of my comrades, trapped and vulnerable. Panic took hold of me. I had to help him, but I couldn't act without thinking. I watched from a safe place, trying to assess the situation. My partner was on the ground, trying to take cover, but he was in an unfavorable position. The screams were mixing with the gunshots, creating a deafening chaos. As I watched the scene, I realized that I didn't have much time. The situation was critical, and I had to act fast. I reached for my rifle, but my hands were shaking. I could not let doubt paralyze me. I took a deep breath and prepared for movement. Cautiously, I crawled to the side, looking for an angle that would allow me to shoot without being seen. The darkness covered me, but the danger was also increasing. Bullets whistled around me and the sound of war intensified. I found a place where I could take the right position. With my heart in my throat, I raised my rifle, aiming at one of the enemy. The tension was unbearable. At that moment, everything stopped. The rain, the screams, the gunshots. Everything faded into a deafening silence. I took aim, and my finger stopped millimeters from the trigger. I realized that there was one more element to the scene. The fear in my partner's eyes. A fear I could not afford to ignore. A man's life was in my hands, and the responsibility hit me like a bolt of lightning. In my mind, everything was chaos. I pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot was like thunder that broke the night. The figure of the enemy faded into the darkness. And my companion, seeing the opportunity, got up and started running towards me. But before I could react, I heard a terrifying scream, and everything fell apart. The sound of the gunshot echoed in my mind, and confusion engulfed me again. My companion fell to the ground, and horror gripped me. I didn't know if he had missed the shot, or if he had been hit by another bullet. The sound of my own heart pounding was deafening. I realized that I was being surrounded. The rain had hidden the movements of the enemies, and now they were close. I felt the pressure building in my chest, the terror of knowing I was about to be discovered. The rain became a veil of despair, and darkness enveloped me. I started to retreat, looking for the exit, but the slippery terrain betrayed me. I fell backwards, and the mud trapped me. At that instant, I saw the shadows approaching, figures emerging from the darkness, and I knew I could not escape. The war had taken its toll, and the outcome was uncertain. As I tried to get up, I saw several enemy soldiers advancing. The confusion was total, and fear turned into palpable despair. I knew that if they caught me, there would be no way out. I managed to stand up, mud covering my boots. Something in me had hardened. I began to run, with no clear destination, just the instinct to survive. The shadows followed me, but I could not look back. It was a deadly game, and uncertainty pushed me with every step. As I ran, I heard more gunshots, but this time it wasn't just the enemies. It was my companions, the sound of fighting continuing all around us. The war was raging in all its fury, and I was just a pawn on this deadly chessboard. I found a place to hide, a small shelter in the middle of the storm. I crouched down, trying to catch my breath as the rain continued to fall. The sound of combat faded into the distance, and in that moment of calm, I realized that the war was not only being fought on the battlefield, it was also being fought in the minds of each of us. The terror of the unknown gripped me, and the uncertainty was a weight I could not bear. I knew I had to find my companions, but the thought of coming out of hiding filled me with fear. I strained to hear any sound that might tell me what had happened. The voices of my comrades echoed in my mind, and the thought of losing someone overwhelmed me. War had a cruel way of stripping people of everything they loved, and I didn't want to be another victim. After what seemed like an eternity, the sound of combat began to fade, but silence took over. Cautiously, I began to emerge from my hiding place, feeling that every step was an internal battle. When we went outside, the landscape was desolate. The shadows of the night had dissipated, but the rain continued, creating a gloomy atmosphere. I walked slowly, trying to find some sign of my companions. The ground was covered with mud, and the air was permeated with the smell of gunpowder and wet earth. I saw a figure in the distance. My heart stopped for a moment. It was a comrade, but he was wounded. His face was covered in mud and blood, and his gaze reflected despair. I ran towards him, feeling hope reborn within me. When I arrived, I realized that I was not the only one who had survived. There were others, some wounded, some in shock, but all were alive. The storm had passed, and although the battle was not over, at least we had made it out alive. As we gathered, the rain began to taper off, and the sky was slowly clearing. The storm had left its mark, but it had also brought a new clarity. Despite the horror of that night, we knew we were stronger together. Uncertainty still lurked, but in those shared moments, I found the strength to face whatever came. The war would never be easy, and the struggle for survival would continue, but in the midst of the storm, I had learned that hope can emerge even in the darkest of times. And so, as the sun began to peek through the clouds, I knew that, despite everything, we were alive. The rain was falling furiously that night, as if the sky was overflowing. The drops were hitting the asphalt of the road, creating puddles that reflected the lights of passing cars. But at this moment, I had no intention of continuing on the road. My car had decided to break down in the middle of nowhere, and even though I had tried to start it over and over again, the engine refused to respond. I got out of the vehicle, feeling the water soaking my clothes. Darkness enveloped me, and the only sound was that of falling water and the distant roar of thunder. I looked around me, searching for some sign of civilization. There was nothing, just a dusty road and brush that stretched into a dense forest on one side and an empty lot on the other. After a moment, I decided it would be best to seek help. The last gas station had been left behind, and I didn't know how long it had been since I had seen it. With a resigned sigh, I headed into the brush, feeling each step taking me further away from the safety of the car. The rain was still falling, and the darkness felt deeper among the trees. As I walked, anxiety began to take hold of me. I hadn't seen anyone since I had been stranded, and the thought of being alone in the woods filled me with trepidation. The night seemed to come alive, and the air felt tense. The feeling of being watched intensified. I continued moving forward, my feet sloshing in the mud, until I came to a small crossroads. A wooden sign, weathered by time and rain, indicated two paths, one that led deeper into the forest and another that seemed to lead up a hill. At that moment, I felt the weight of the decision I had to make. The rain was falling harder, and the wind was howling through the trees, as if warning me of something. I opted for the path up the hill. The idea of climbing up and finding an elevated spot where I could see some of the road seemed like the best option. I began to ascend, struggling against the slippery mud. As I progressed, the darkness grew thicker, and the sounds of the forest became an eerie murmur. I reached the top of the hill. From there, I could see a small hut in the distance, dimly lit by a light in the window. My heart skipped a beat. The hut looked like a safe haven, a place where I could find help. Without a second thought, I headed for it. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, but the atmosphere became ominous. The cabin, though it looked cozy, had an air of neglect. The doorframe was worn and the paint was peeling. However, the sound of the rain was deafening, and I had no choice. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I pushed it gently and it creaked open. I walked in, feeling the cold, damp air around me. The room was dark, with only a flickering lamp illuminating the place. The decor was rudimentary: a couple of old chairs, a wooden table, and an unlit fireplace. The place smelled musty and damp wood, and the atmosphere was charged with palpable tension. As I looked around, I noticed something strange on the walls. Framed photographs showed different people, each with an eerie expression. I looked closer and realized that they all bore a striking resemblance. They were men, women, and children with features that resembled my own. I began to feel a knot in my stomach. I turned toward the door, but it slammed shut, as if an invisible force had pushed it shut. The sound of wind and rain faded, and the silence became overwhelming. The feeling of being trapped began to grow in my chest. I looked out the window, but the storm had obscured the view. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I turned sharply, my heart pounding. A man appeared in the gloom, his dark figure silhouetted against the dim light. His gaze was piercing, and a sinister smile was plastered on his face. Fear gripped me. I tried to back away toward the door, but the man moved quickly, blocking my path. I could see in his eyes a mixture of amusement and malice, as if he was enjoying my desperation. "Are you lost, friend?" he said, his voice low and almost whispery. I didn't respond. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, and the need to escape became urgent. The man took a step closer, and I could notice a scar running across his face. "Don't worry, everyone is here for a reason," he continued, pointing to the pictures on the walls. Horror gripped me as I understood their meaning. They were not just photographs. They were portraits of missing people, each one marked by time in this cabin. The man smiled even wider, as if he expected me to understand the gravity of the situation. As I stepped back, my feet tripped over a chair and I fell to the floor. The man approached. His smile widened and I felt the air rush out of me. What did he want from me? The thought that I might be just another victim filled me with dread. At that moment, the survival instinct kicked in. I quickly got up and ran to the window. Without thinking, I tried to open it, but it was stuck. I looked back, and the man was slowly moving forward, enjoying my distress. It was as if he was playing with me, and time stretched into an eternal instant. I managed to open the window with an effort. The rain hit me hard, but I didn't have time to think about it. I jumped out, landing in a puddle. The cold of the water shook me, but I didn't stop. I ran into the woods, feeling the darkness envelop me. The sound of my footsteps mingled with the rain, and adrenaline pushed me forward. I didn't know if the man was coming after me, but I couldn't risk looking. I ran and ran, fear tightening my chest. Suddenly, I stumbled and fell to the ground, hitting my knee. The pain made me scream, but I couldn't let myself give up. I quickly got up and continued running, moving deeper into the forest. The rain was still falling, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. As I ran, I thought of my family, of what I would leave behind if I failed to escape. The thought of never seeing my loved ones again filled me with renewed determination. I found a path that seemed to lead to the road. Hope filled me, and I picked up the pace. However, the feeling of being followed never disappeared. I looked back, but saw nothing, only darkness and rain. As I reached the trail, I saw the lights of a car in the distance. I felt a new surge of hope. I ran toward the road, and as I got closer, I raised my hand to stop the vehicle. The car stopped, and the window slowly rolled down. The driver, an older man, looked at me with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. I couldn't speak, so I nodded and climbed into the car. As I sat down, I felt a momentary relief, but the uneasiness remained. The man started driving, and I briefly told him what had happened, leaving out details that might have frightened him. As we went on, the rain began to slow down, but the tightness in my chest would not go away. I looked back, expecting to see the cabin or the man who had tried to catch me, but there was nothing. The road was empty, and the forest seemed quiet. After a while, we arrived in a village. The man took me to the police station, where they helped me tell my story. I was assured that there would be patrols in the area, but something in me knew that the cabin was still there, hidden in the darkness of the forest. That night, police organized a search of the area, guided by the coordinates he had provided. While waiting for the rain to clear, the officers reviewed reports of missing persons in the region. My account echoed in their ears, and the concern on their faces was palpable. At dawn, groups of police and volunteers went into the forest. The sky was still cloudy, but the rain had stopped, allowing visibility to improve. Meanwhile, I stayed at the station, anxious and fearful of what they might find. It was a long and tense day. Each passing hour seemed like an eternity. The hours slipped by, and my thoughts were filled with images of the cabin, the man with the scar, and the photographs I had seen. As evening fell, a group of officers returned, and their expressions said it all. They had found the cabin. The police began to clear up several cases of disappearances that had been unsolved for years. The photos he had seen on the walls were not just souvenirs. They were evidence of crimes that had gone unanswered. The cabin became the epicenter of an investigation that revealed the dark history of a man who had been hunting his victims for decades. The news spread quickly, and although the horror of what had happened there haunted me, I was relieved to learn that the search had borne fruit. The police were able to rescue people who had been missing, and the man was arrested, facing charges I could never have imagined. As the days passed, life in town began to return to normal. However, the rain continued to fall, reminding me how close I had come to being another victim. The experience had left deep marks on me, but also a lesson. Darkness can hide many secrets, and sometimes the truth is closer than we think. Although the terror of that night in the cabin would never completely fade, justice had prevailed. I knew that, although the scars of that experience would be with me forever, I had found a way to face my fears and move forward. The rain, which once symbolized terror, now also reminded me of the hope that the truth always finds a way to come to light. The rain lashed furiously as I drove down that forgotten road, a path that my GPS seemed to have taken as a joke. I was on a work trip in a city hundreds of miles from home, a region I was barely familiar with. My colleagues had warned me to avoid that area, that the road was unsafe, but I ignored their advice, believing I had everything under control. Looking out the window, the storm distorted the landscape, a world of shadows and silhouettes in which I felt trapped. The clock on the dashboard read 11 o'clock at night, and although the car was moving slowly, I could not see more than a couple of meters ahead. The rain had become an impenetrable curtain, as if the sky itself was determined to make me lose my way. The asphalt disappeared under a layer of mud and water, and I was forced to stop in the middle of nowhere. Trees stretched out in all directions, and the sound of the rain hammering on the roof of the car reminded me that I was all alone in that unchanging darkness. I felt a weight in my chest, a mixture of uncertainty and panic. I tried to calm myself down, turning on the GPS again and trying to find some alternative route. But the signal was weak, and I was unable to load a new path. For a moment, I thought about retracing my steps, but the thought of facing that same muddy and slippery road in the dark made me hesitate. I decided to wait a few minutes, hoping that the storm would subside. However, with each passing minute, the rain became more intense, the thunder more deafening, and the anguish, an invisible monster growing in my mind. After a while, a shadow moved in the rearview mirror. My heart skipped a beat as I saw someone approaching. I thought it was a lost passerby or a local peasant seeking shelter, but I soon realized it was not an isolated person. A second figure appeared behind the first, and then a third. Their faces were indistinguishable in the gloom. I could only see their hunched bodies, slowly approaching my vehicle. There were several of them, and their presence chilled my blood. It was not only the rain that made my chest feel tight. It was that silent procession of shadows that approached, like a threat that I did not understand, but that I sensed was dangerous. The first figure reached the side of the car and tapped gently on the window. For a moment, I thought they were looking for help. Maybe they needed directions or some shelter. But then my eyes caught something in their gaze, a calculating coldness that left no room for doubt. I looked over to the passenger seat, and there was my briefcase, my wallet, and my cell phone. Everything that, in the wrong hands, could turn me into a victim. I pressed my lips together and tried not to look the stranger in the eyes, convinced that if I showed any sign of weakness, they would notice. The man at the window waited a moment, and after a sharp rap on the door, he backed up a few steps. Unease came over me, and I knew something was terribly wrong. I decided to start the engine, but the car wouldn't start. I felt panic rising in my chest, as if an invisible claw was squeezing my heart. I tried again, turning the key in the ignition, and nothing. The noise of the rain was intensifying, and each thump of water against the windshield seemed like a warning cry. The men outside looked at each other, and one of them smiled, with an expression of cruelty that chilled me to the bone. Then, I realized that I had no other choice. I left my belongings and opened the opposite door to go out in the opposite direction to them. The rain hit me like an icy wall, making every step I took on the soaked ground difficult. I didn't look back, because I knew they were following me. I could hear their footsteps in the mud, barely audible whispers mingling with the sound of the storm. I was alone and lost in the middle of the darkness, and every meter I advanced, I felt my strength fading. I stumbled several times, and each fall seemed to invite my pursuers to close the distance. The forest surrounding the road was thick, and the vegetation hindered me at every step. In the distance, a flash of lightning illuminated the sky, and in that flash I could see them, approaching. There were 4 of them in all, each one closer than the last, and their figures were drawn in the glare like grotesque and menacing shadows. My breath hitched, and fatigue weighed on my feet as if I were carrying stones tied to my legs. At that moment, I did not know whether to keep moving forward or to stop and face the terror that was chasing me. After what seemed like an eternity of running, I arrived at a kind of clearing. I felt a false sense of relief, believing that perhaps there I would find an escape route, a road or some sign of civilization. But there was nothing. Only trees, mud, and a dark sky that looked at me with indifference. The rain did not stop, and its sound enveloped me in a bubble of desolation. I wondered if that would be the last night of my life, if those men would be the last faces I would see before disappearing without a trace. I felt their presence closer and closer, the sound of their footsteps treading in the mud, the rustling of the branches, and the panting of their heavy breathing. It was as if they were playing with me, as if they wanted to make me run, just to enjoy my desperation, my palpable fear. I began to believe that this persecution was no coincidence, that those men not only wanted to rob me, but that they enjoyed seeing how uncertainty and terror consumed me. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was clouding over. I could barely think clearly. I could barely remember which direction I had taken. Every step plunged me into the mud, every breath became a titanic effort, and every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. Suddenly, I slipped and fell on an exposed root, hitting my knee. The pain was excruciating, but the fear was even greater. I couldn't just stand there, exposed, vulnerable, waiting for them to catch up with me. With all my strength, I got to my feet and started running again, limping. I knew I wouldn't last much longer, that my body was on the verge of collapse. My clothes were soaked, my hands were shaking, and my vision was blurred by the rain that kept falling on my face. But something inside me refused to give up. Something inside me was pushing me to keep going, to not stop. Finally, my eyes caught a faint light in the distance. It was small and distant, but at that moment it represented my only hope. Without hesitation, I headed toward it, pushing through branches and bushes that scratched my skin. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, revealing what appeared to be a small abandoned cabin. It was a precarious shelter, but it was better than the outdoors, better than facing my pursuers in the open. I walked up to the door and pushed it open. As I opened it, a musty smell hit me, but I didn't care. I closed the door behind me, trying to catch my breath as I looked for somewhere to hide in case they came. The interior was dark and cold, and I could barely make out some old furniture covered in dust. I hid behind a broken bookshelf, waiting silently, praying they wouldn't find me. I heard their footsteps outside, their macabre laughter that the wind carried to my ears. I knew they wouldn't stop until they found me, that it wasn't enough for them to simply steal me. I wanted to believe that the cabin would offer me shelter, but deep down, I knew it wasn't so. The door was flimsy, and if they decided to enter, there would be nothing to protect me. A few minutes later, the sound of his footsteps drifted away, lost in the darkness. I felt a fleeting relief, as if the storm had given me a respite, a chance to escape. I dared to come out of my hiding place and peek out of one of the windows. The rain was still falling hard, and the forest was a maze of shadows and sounds that blended into a symphony of terror. As I waited, convinced that they were gone, I felt a mixture of relief and paranoia. The cabin became sepulchrally silent. Only the pounding of the rain remained constant, like a macabre metronome that reminded me of the nightmare I was living. However, I couldn't stay there forever. Nerves and adrenaline were pushing me to do something, to move before those men returned. So, making sure not to make any noise, I left the cabin and started running again, this time with a clear objective, to find a path or a road that would take me to a safe place. After a while of non-stop running, my legs were on the verge of collapse, and my eyesight was blurring with exhaustion. But then, through the trees, I saw some lights twinkling in the distance. The road. The sight filled me with hope, and although my body resisted, I managed to take the last few steps until I reached the edge of the asphalt. It didn't take long for a vehicle to appear, and seeing my desperate state, it stopped. With my face soaked and muddy, I explained what had happened between gasps and pleas. The driver, surprised, allowed me to get in, and we quickly drove to the nearest police station. When we arrived, the police took my statement and sent units to the area in search of the criminals. Unfortunately, they were unable to find them, and those men disappeared into the night, as if they were shadows. Nevertheless, the memory of that night remained with me, engraved in my memory. Every time I heard the sound of rain, or felt the darkness envelop me. I relived the pure fear of those moments. I realized that I had narrowly survived, and that experience would mark me forever, an invisible scar that would remind me that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from the unknown, but from the human shadows that lurk in the darkest corners of the world. I left work late that night, tired and overwhelmed, and to top it off, the sky had opened up in one of the fiercest storms I had seen in months. The drops hit the asphalt with unrelenting intensity, bouncing off like little bullets of water that blurred my vision and dampened my spirits. I still had to take the subway and walk a few minutes to get home, but with that storm, I preferred not to risk a fever or getting soaked. I'm not one to take cabs often, but that night I saw no alternative. I put out my arm, and with the speed of desperation, I managed to stop a cab that miraculously appeared between the curtain of rain. The cab pulled up right in front of me, and without thinking too much, I opened the door and jumped inside, grateful for the dry warmth inside. As soon as I settled into the back seat, the door closed behind me, insulating me from the storm that was still raging outside. I gave the cab driver my home address, and he nodded silently, not even looking at me. He was an ordinary-looking man, with curly hair and an expressionless face, and although I didn't pay much attention to him at first, later I wished I had. The vehicle started up and drove into the almost deserted streets. At first, nothing seemed out of place. It was just a rainy night, and the silence was interrupted by the pattering of water against the roof and the puddles that the cab gently crossed. But as we went along, I began to notice something strange about the road. The streets I was taking were not the usual ones, and although there was more than one way to reach my destination, I sensed that something about their choice of route was erratic. I struggled to remember the map of the city. The streetlights flickered, almost as if they were melting in the rain, and the silence inside the cab became heavy, dense. Discomfort began to creep into me, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an alternate route. Maybe the cab driver knew some shortcut to avoid the traffic that still remained in the city. Although at that hour, and with that storm, the idea of traffic was absurd. The minutes passed and the road became increasingly unfamiliar, darker, as if we were entering the edge of the city. The street lighting became less frequent and, at times, only the faint light of the headlights illuminated the road. I felt my breathing quicken for no reason, and, as time progressed, a growing tension lodged in my chest. Something was not right. Something in the atmosphere had changed, and a little voice was telling me that maybe it was time to ask the cab driver to stop, that he was taking the wrong road. I tried to fix my gaze on the rearview mirror, waiting for the driver to give some sign that everything was under control, but his expression remained impassive. He stared at the road with a cold intensity, eyes fixed on the darkness, as if he knew it by heart. My discomfort turned to tangible unease, and I could no longer contain the urge to let him know that I noticed something strange about his choice of route. But as soon as I began to open my mouth, he suddenly turned onto an unpaved road, a detour that led to an even more isolated area. The road was practically a path, surrounded by undergrowth and trees that were barely distinguishable in the gloom. Only then did I understand the gravity of the situation I was in. I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the storm outside the car. I was in the middle of nowhere, with a man who had not exchanged a single word with me, in an area where screams could be lost in the rain without anyone hearing them. I tried to stay calm, thinking of a way out, but the options seemed to slip away, to vanish into thin air like the steam that fogged the car windows. The cab stopped. The engine was turned off, and the silence became heavy, like an oppressive blanket crushing me against the seat. I stood motionless, watching every movement of the driver, who, for the first time, turned his face towards me. His expression remained expressionless, almost calm, but there was something in his eyes that betrayed a dark intent, a dehumanizing coldness. Without a word, he turned and opened the door on his side, stepping out of the car and leaving me alone inside, I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid he could hear it, even from outside. I thought about staying inside and waiting, but I didn't know what or who. The rain was coming down so hard I could barely see through the windows. However, my instincts told me that staying there was not safe. I didn't know if he was armed or what his intentions were, but I didn't want to wait to find out. In desperation, I tried to open the door to run out, but found that the back doors were locked from the outside. I was trapped. I looked around, searching for a way out, a loophole, anything that would allow me to escape. But everything seemed locked, sealed like a trap. My breathing became more and more frantic, and panic gripped me with a rapidity I had never experienced before. In the midst of my despair, I saw his figure approaching again, walking slowly around the car. He was carrying something in his hands, something I couldn't make out in the gloom. Panic clouded my senses, and I began to bang on the window with all my might, hoping that someone, whoever it was, could hear me. Although I knew that in that remote place and under that storm, my efforts were in vain. The man stopped by my door and opened the car, his movements slow and calculated, as if he knew I had no other choice. He reached out his hand, looked at me with that unsettling expressionlessness, and without a word, took my wallet and phone from me, looking carefully at each of my belongings. His gaze was analytical, as if he was assessing how much I was worth, how much time I had left. And then, just as suddenly as he started, the man slammed the door shut and walked a few steps away. I watched him, bewildered and terrified, not understanding what was happening. But before I could react, he started the engine, got out of the vehicle and lost himself in the trees, leaving me out in the open, with no other company than the storm and the emptiness that stretched out around me. For a while I remained motionless, my mind in chaos, not knowing what to do. The rain continued to fall heavily, and finally, survival instinct forced me to get out of the vehicle and start walking. Every step I took in that deep, muddy darkness filled me with a growing fear. But I knew that the only way to get out of there was to move forward without stopping, without looking back. Hours passed, or so I felt. The rain didn't stop, and the cold was seeping into my bones, but I continued, leaving behind the fear and replacing it with a blind determination, an urgent need to escape from that place. Finally, after much walking, I came to a road and glimpsed the lights of an approaching vehicle. I waved desperately, and the driver stopped, surprised to see my condition. He picked me up and drove me to the city. The experience left me forever scarred, a constant reminder that it doesn't take a monster or a supernatural creature to feel true terror, but the cold, calculating act of a human being who chooses to take everything from you and leave you at the mercy of the night. Since then, every storm and every rainy night brings fear back to me, a warning that not all dangers are visible, and that at any time, under any circumstances, darkness can appear in the most common, most everyday, and most human form possible. The rain was pounding with unusual fury that night, soaking the asphalt and erasing almost all visibility from the road. I could barely see more than a few feet in front of the car, and my hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The storm had begun with increasing intensity, and the drive home was becoming an endurance test I had not anticipated. At some point, I noticed that a car in the left lane seemed to wobble, as if the driver was having trouble maintaining control. I decided to change lanes to keep myself safe and give him enough room. I didn't want to risk any accidents, especially on such a dark and wet night. I activated my turn signals and moved slowly to the right, keeping a safe distance. At first, I thought that would be enough, that I could relax. But instantly, I felt something strange in the air, a kind of tension in the air, like a silent warning. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that the other car also changed lanes, coinciding with my movement. It was an abrupt, almost desperate maneuver, as if its only objective was to follow me. I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that it could be a coincidence. Perhaps the driver simply had the same destination. However, a second later I changed lanes again, and the other car did so at the same time without even slowing down. My heart began to pound. I knew this was not normal, and paranoia was taking over my thoughts. Was he following me? Why? Maybe it was my nerves playing tricks on me, or the tension of driving in the middle of a storm. But when I tried to pull ahead, accelerating to put distance between us, the other car reacted immediately. It accelerated as well, coming dangerously close to my bumper, so close that I felt its crushing presence like a dark shadow in my rearview mirror. The situation was becoming surreal, and fear coiled in my chest like a snake. I looked in the rearview mirror, waiting for the driver to slow down, or at least slow down, but nothing changed. The rain continued to fall furiously, and the windshield wipers barely managed to keep the glass halfway clean. As I struggled to control the car and my nerves, the vehicle behind me began to play with its position, swaying from side to side, as if it wanted to unsettle me. The seconds became a kind of eternity. I sped up again, hoping to lose him in some nook and cranny of the road, but he responded to my every move with relentless precision. I was beginning to understand that this was no coincidence, that I was trapped in some kind of sadistic game, one in which my pursuer was feeding on my fear, my bewilderment, and delighting in every desperate attempt I made to escape. I tried to stay calm, to look for an alternative route, but the road didn't offer many exits, and the few curves looked dangerously slippery in the storm. My only hope was to reach a brighter area, a stretch with more traffic, where I could get to safety. However, the road was still deserted, as if all the cars had disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with my stalker. Suddenly, I saw an exit up ahead and turned the steering wheel sharply, taking the turn onto a secondary road. I thought maybe I could throw him off, that the abrupt maneuver would leave him behind. But no sooner had I gone a few meters than the roar of my pursuer's engine grew louder, and I noticed that he had also taken the same exit, accelerating with inhuman ferocity. I was completely overcome with despair. My throat felt dry and cold sweat slid down my forehead, mingling with the reflection of the lights bouncing off the mirror. Every second I realized that I was completely trapped. I tried to remember if there was a gas station, a restaurant, or any place that could be a safe haven. But my thoughts were in chaos. The sound of the rain, the windshield wipers, and the roar of the car behind me blended into an oppressive symphony. It was at that moment that my pursuer began to move even closer, sticking to my bumper like an extension of my own car. I felt his presence so close that it felt like he was about to ram me. I tried to maintain control, but every time I slowed down or tried to turn, he replicated my movements with almost frightening precision. Seconds later, the car behind me turned on its high beams, momentarily blinding me and causing panic to hit me hard. My visibility was reduced to almost nothing, and with my heart pounding, I spun again to dodge what seemed like an onslaught. The rain was now almost a solid curtain in front of me, and the other car's high beams erratically illuminated every corner of the road, casting misshapen shadows that seemed to mock my desperation. Fear turned into adrenaline, a survival instinct that told me I couldn't afford a single mistake. The road was getting narrower and narrower, and the sound of the rain was deafening. I tried to focus on maintaining control of the car, but at every turn, I felt my pursuer was closer, lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. The other car began to move alongside me, trying to get right next to me. I could see it passing me, sticking dangerously close to my side, as if it wanted to force me off the road. I turned the steering wheel sharply, trying to stay in my lane and avoid impact. My breathing was rapid and choppy, every muscle in my body tense from the effort of resisting. In a desperate attempt, I turned the steering wheel and accelerated even more, pushing it to the limit, praying that my car would hold on. I felt the engine roar, straining to the max, and my hands trembled on the steering wheel as I watched the lights of the other car fade a little behind, as if I was finally managing to leave it behind. But it was nothing more than an illusion. As soon as I slowed down a bit to regain control, the car reappeared in my rearview mirror, even closer, even more menacing. My mind was on the verge of collapse, struggling to find a way out of a maze of darkness and rain. Finally, after what seemed like hours of chasing, I saw the lights of a small gas station. Without thinking, I turned into the lighted area, slamming on the brakes and getting out of the car in a clumsy, desperate move. I ran towards the station, hoping to find some sign of help, some human figure that could rescue me from this nightmare. But as I turned around, I noticed that my pursuer had not followed me to the station. His car stopped right at the entrance, and from there, his barely visible figure watched me, motionless, as if he wanted me to know that this was not over. He was a silent, faceless presence, someone who had decided to make me his prey, and who now enjoyed the fear he had provoked in me. I stood there, with bated breath and exhausted body, watching as his car slowly turned around and disappeared into the darkness.